to show you the front pages because, quite frankly, it's only one story really on most of them, and that is Harry and Meghan. And you know the drill, it's never going to go away. But we're going to go inside the papers. We're joined by the former Conservative advisor, Claire Pearsall, and the environmental campaigner, Amy Cameron. Welcome back, ladies. I'm sorry you were cut short a little bit by the government minister popping on the show. So hopefully we'll have a good rip through the papers with you. Amy, let's start with the front of the Times.
Yeah.
1 in 7 being denied access to GP appointments.
Yeah, so this is data about GP appointments in October. 5 million people were unable to make an appointment with their GP, and another 2 million faced a wait of more than a month to see their doctor. Clearly not acceptable, and adding on to the endless stories about the extent to which the NHS is on its knees. So we've had waiting list problems, we've obviously had the shocking stats about ambulances unable to get into hospitals, and now I think a very familiar refrain. Lots of people will have tried to make GP appointments. We've spoken already this morning about soaring illnesses and the implications that has. I think it is unignorable that the NHS is struggling. More and more people are either switching to private or facing inadequate care within the NHS system. Even if you put aside the human aspect of this, which is people being sick and unwell and potentially worse than that, there's also massive economic implications of this. We know that there's a labour shortage right now, workforce shortage, and lots of people long-term sick. So it's absolutely integral, both in terms of our welfare, but also in terms of our economy, that the government prioritises investment in the NHS and getting it back up to the standard that it needs to be to allow people to live like happy, healthy, productive lives.
Well, bring Claire in here because are we chucking record amounts of money into the NHS all the time? It seems to be getting more and more money all the time. But personally, I think I've got more chance of getting a Glastonbury ticket than I have a GP appointment.
Work-shy GPs or just a shortage of GPs?
I think it's a bit of both. But if I don't call it like 1 nanosecond past 8, it's like forget about it. So what is it? Is it work-shy GPs or?
I think it's an accumulation of all of it, but it's also the fact that we have not looked for decades at the model of the NHS. When it was first set up, it was for purpose in the 1940s, and it worked. In 2022, with the amount of diseases that we can now treat, with the technology that's come on board and the amount of people using the service, it doesn't work. And I think that throwing good money after bad isn't going to make any difference whatsoever, and we are soon going to become an NHS with a country attached to it, because that is how big the employer is. It is enormous. It is fantastic. Please don't think, please don't pile into me and think that I want to sell off the NHS or I think it's bad. I don't. I just think
Tories want to sell it all off.
Absolutely, and that's the argument you always have. You can never have this conversation about should we have a look at what we want it to do and how we can make that work, because at the moment it just doesn't, and it hasn't for decades. It's not
it's not
problem.
a binary choice, is it, between the NHS free at the point of use and then an American-style system where the poor just cannot get access to healthcare. There are measures in between that need to be considered, surely. Don't you think, Amy?
I don't know. I mean, it's predictably, I don't know.
I wonder what Amy's take on that is.
I think the reality is that the cost of the NHS is going up. We have an ageing population who we have an obligation to look after. So for me, the question is not should we fund the NHS, but who pays for the NHS? And I think increasingly it is necessary for us to have a conversation about those with the broadest shoulders, as the expression goes, bearing a greater amount of the cost for this. I think suggesting that NHS workers are work shy is deeply troubling. These are people who worked right through the pandemic. These are people who... Yes, of course.
Face-to-face appointments are next to impossible to get.
No, absolutely, and that's not acceptable, right? But what are we driving at here? Are we driving at a two-tier system where those who have money can afford to go private and those who can't are left with a substandard service?
I think that's such an emotive and misleading argument, though, because when you look to Europe, where there's a lot of things linked into people's jobs, it's not about those with money can't. You get insurance and it's paid for by your company. It's a business benefit and things like that. It takes the pressure off the state.
But that's...
Or you've got systems like in Australia, where you get it's tax deductible.
But I think looking at it being linked to your employment is so problematic. And I've got lots of American friends who are here in the UK who talk about how vulnerable that makes you in an employer-employee relationship. If your healthcare is reliant on your boss, think about the change of dynamic that creates in the workplace in terms of your dependency and the rights that you have and the demands that you can make.
But it doesn't mean that we can't have those conversations, because everything that we put forward, let's have a look at doing this system look at Australia, look at what happens on the continent, and people come back with, oh, but no, it's the NHS, and you don't want to change the worker rights if you're looking at offering it as an employment contract. And then you don't, it's that endless kind of argument of whichever argument you put forward, somebody's going to say, oh no, we need the NHS and it's sacred, and
well, that's the problem.
And we love it, we love the NHS, and we are the first ones to defend it, but it isn't working, and you need to fix that.
I agree with
just
that.
By chucking money at it doesn't work.
Let's move on to another story now, if we can, because we could talk all day about the NHS and reforming it. Tell us what you think on GBNEWS, because I think this one just won't go away. Billions and billions are chucked into it, and we seem to be having the same story every year. NHS in crisis again, has been every year. Claire, a story that we've been covering all morning, and this is the idea, we talked about this with doctors earlier, giving penicillin out proactively to all children to head off Strep A, and this just seems counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It does, and hearts obviously go out to anybody who's lost a child recently to Strep A. I mean, they are hideous stories, no one wants to read about them, but I'm not sure as to the effectiveness of handing out penicillin to every child. I know
to be clear, I do think it's in cases where there has been an outbreak, known outbreak in the school.
But again, I'm just really uncomfortable with this blanket treatment of giving medication out to those children, some of whom may not need it. And I just wonder if this is a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction at the moment. The infections will settle down, and it is a really worrying time. I have a 14-year-old, and I do look at him at the moment with a cough and a cold, and you think, oh, is this going to go the wrong way? And some kids are going to be really, really ill, but I'm just uncomfortable, I think, at a blanket approach to this kind of health concern. And what happens when the next one comes up? What do we do then?
Amy, let's move on, because I just want to up the story count. Otherwise, we can spend all day focusing on just a couple of stories. You've chosen this in the Express about parking charges, something that really exercises a lot of people. And Jacob Rees-Mogg and Andrea Leadsom have come out with a suggestion, particularly around Christmas, to try and save the high street.
Yeah, it's very unusual for me to agree with Jacob Rees-Mogg on anything.
Make a note of it.
But I think saving the high streets is a kind of that is something that I think we can all get behind, right? We know that our high streets have been declining. They're a vital part not just of our kind of economy, but also I think of our sense of community. I'm lucky to live in an area of London which has quite a thriving local high street, but really interestingly, in that scenario, what's massively benefited has not been reducing parking charges, it's been quite the opposite. So they've actually reduced access to cars. Now, I don't want to be a Grinch around the Christmas period, and I recognise that for lots of people this will be welcome news, but I think we do need to think longer term about how we give our high streets an opportunity to flourish. And I don't think increasing fumes and tailbacks is particularly festive. I would love to see greater pedestrianisation. I'd love to see greater public transport access to our local high streets. And I also think we need to look at business rates, because too many small businesses and communities are treated in a way that's completely disproportionate to the big tech giants, Amazon, etc. So I think there's a bigger conversation here.
I think abolishing parking fees is way too common sense. It will never catch on. It should do, though, but it probably won't. Claire, let's move swiftly on with Keir Starmer trying to make a big noise. His plans to abolish the House of Lords have some kick.
We're going to do private schools to end on.
Yeah, sure.
That's all right.
Private
He's
schools,
throwing back on that, Claire, and he was saying that he
is.
doesn't want to abolish them. And actually, there are some good ones he managed to come out with on the Today programme yesterday morning.
It's amazing how his position can change so quickly, especially when somebody highlights his own education. I think that the argument over taxing private schools is lazy. I don't think we need to have it. I don't think it's going to solve any problems. It's not as if he has said to put VAT on private school fees is going to be ring-fenced and put into the education system for the benefit of others. So I think this is one of those arguments that he's going to back down on really quickly. And as we've seen, he's already stated that he thinks they're great and people should have the choice to be able to put their child into a private school, but he wants to tax them into oblivion at the same time.
I think that's
so you
the
can't
problem,
have it
isn't
all
it? Because it's going to squeeze those middle earners, those people who were just about managing, those independent schools, I think, locally, the sort of Wimbledon Highs or the Putney Highs. And the only ones that will survive will be the big Eatons or whatever else that has a huge amount of foreign money, Chinese students. It'll be the British kids, the local sort of affordable ones that are squeezed out, and then there's a higher burden on the state, Amy.
I just think this is really interesting off the back of the high street story, though, right? Because If I were a local business owner running a small shop on a high street, I'd be questioning why private schools aren't paying VAT. I have to charge VAT on all the services that I provide. I think it's really difficult to make an ethical argument for VAT not being applied to private school fees. Private schools are not a public good, and any attempt to present them as such is really misleading.
Well,
they're not a public good. The vast 7% of the UK population go to private school, and yet those people that do are so wildly overrepresented. Cabinet is 61% privately educated,
Labour
I
bars,
think.
quite a few Labour boys
One in
once went 1 in 7. So
I'm not going to defend. I'm not going to defend Keir. I'm not going to defend Keir Starmer on this one. I think that he is flip-flopping on this. I think they need to come out and say that private schools should absolutely be paying their way. And unsurprisingly for me, longer term, I think we need to have a conversation about the role they play.
How about we raise up the standard of state education rather than punishing those that pay for private education for their children? Why not raise those levels of education?
But those two things are not mutually exclusive, right? I think we can both be raising up the standards of the public education system, which we absolutely should. But I think in these economic times, many of you viewers will be looking at the fact that there's no VAT on private school fees and questioning why. Who's that benefiting? And it's not the majority of the British population.
It benefits those hard-working parents who save and scrimp everything to get their kids to what they see to have a better chance, a better start in life, and it would affect those marginal families, not the overseas students, not the Etonians. So it does
and it also
price
stops
out
the state having to educate an extra, they estimate around 90,000 children. But my question would be, what happens when we start penalising all of these schools and we end up just creating divisions amongst children? We're creating this kind of, is it a class war, an ideological war that of all the things to choose that surely going after? Why are we talking about this? I don't understand.
But surely nothing divides children more than separating them at school age into the haves and the have-nots.
We were always talking about it before, and people were getting on with it.
This is a hugely popular.
I really don't.
You don't think children in private school notice that they're not being surrounded by children of different backgrounds? You don't think that shapes how they think about the world?
They don't look at it and say, "Oh, well, I'm here and I don't have any friends from a working class background in a private school." No,
but that should be a problem, right? Martin, I'm really surprised by you. You're always repping the working classes.
No, listen. I went to a comprehensive. I'm a coal miner's son. I love comprehensives, but I also have no beef with private schools. I think Starmer score an own goal. It's a politics of envy. I think it makes the Labour look like what everyone thinks they are.
I think
they're against aspiration and they're against people with privilege. I think it's sending out the wrong message. That's just me. Anyway.
It is a divisive issue, and look, nobody wants a two-tier system. Wouldn't it be a wonderful world where we could just all guarantee our kids had a great education and those who wanted to send them privately didn't have to feel bad that the kids in the rest of the sector are getting a terrible deal? It's such a shame.
Let's drive towards that, I think, as an aspiration.
There we go. Apparently we do have time. We do or we don't? We do. Sorry, right. We thought we had time for another story. We don't, so we're going to draw a line under that. Claire Pissell, Amy Cameron, always good to have a disagreement in the papers. We look forward to more of the same just after 7:30.